It's 2014 now, and we have reason to be more concerned since there's a sort of a backlash happening in Washington led by NERC, which is the lobby for the electric power industry, to basically silence those who are trying to raise these issues. Just last week, there were congressional hearings not focused on what we should do to protect the national electric grid. I mean, there should be a big question in everybody's minds about what is NERC doing to protect the national electric grid since the Metcalf incident a year ago. And yet they're doing nothing. But what they have decided to do is complain to the Department of Energy about the FERC report that was leaked to the press that revealed that if just 9 transformer substations were attacked in a Metcalf-type way, it could put the whole nation into a protracted blackout lasting weeks or months. You'd think they would be more concerned and that their focus would be on getting the grid protected and not on shutting up the U.S. FERC analysts who did that study, and people like John Wellinghoff, who resigned his chairmanship at U.S. FERC, a rare thing for a Washington bureaucrat to do, and a laudable thing, because he considered it a high priority to break this story to the Wall Street Journal. We might never have known about it if Wellinghoff hadn't resigned and gone public with the story. I've spent my whole professional life working on weapons of mass destruction, nuclear strategy, that sort of thing, beginning when I was a young man at the CIA. And I was their senior analyst on nuclear weapons and strategy, and particularly EMP, which at the time, well, we couldn't talk about that. But the things we are going to talk about today were deeply classified back then, which is why EMP sounds new to people. The Department of Defense, the intelligence community has known about it for 50 years, ever since the Starfish Prime test in 1962. But most of the details were deeply classified. That changed when I worked for the Congressional EMP Commission under Dr. William Graham, who is retired now to California. He had been President Reagan's science advisor and was the chairman of that commission, director of NASA. When he was a young man, he was one of the first U.S. Army scientists who investigated the EMP phenomena that went to Hawaii to look at the effects of the Starfish Prime test. Anyway, the commission, Graham, decided that we needed to declassify a lot of this. So for the first time, basically it's only since 2008 that we've really been able to start talking about this in depth. So for the public, EMP is a new thing. I started the Congressional Advisory Board. The task force is an attempt to fill the vacuum that was left when the Congressional EMP Commission went away. Congressional commissions don't last a long period of time. This one was unusual. It lasted almost a decade, but typically they only last about 18 months to 2 years, and they're not intended to be permanent institutions. This is such a large problem, and unusually, in the case of most congressional commissions, their recommendations are usually followed. We have a national missile defense today because of the Rumsfeld Commission said we needed one, and they turned out to be right. Because North Korea does have nuclear weapons and missiles now that could threaten us. And we reformed the intelligence community based on the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. And we have a cyber command and offices of cybersecurity in the White House and down to the county level because of the recommendations of the Marsh Commission. Yet even though we've had 2 congressional commissions on EMP, the Congressional EMP Commission, and then it was followed by another commission that re-examined the problem. It's called the Strategic Posture Commission. And they came to exactly the same conclusion and made the same recommendations. Moreover, there's been a number of major U.S. government studies by the Department of Energy, the National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, all arriving at the same conclusion about that this is an existential threat. And by that I mean, we concluded that given our current unpreparedness, 9 of 10 Americans could die within a year. A nuclear EMP attack or a natural Carrington-class geomagnetic storm. X-flare is a different kind of a phenomena that wouldn't likely have the kind of catastrophic consequences we're worried about. It'd be very disruptive of satellites and the like. But a geomagnetic storm on a Carrington scale, or like the 1921 railroad storm, which was take the 1921 railroad storm. I mean, that was only in 1/10 as powerful as Carrington. But the National Academy of Sciences estimated that if that happened today, it would cause a blackout lasting 4 to 10 years. The 1921 railroad storm would be like focused on a continent, The railroad storm, when it occurred in 21, was focused on North America. Even that recently, we weren't a heavily electrified country. That didn't happen until the Roosevelt administration. The people seems to have forgotten it already, but it was just last February, March, and April that we went through our most serious ever nuclear crisis with North Korea, where they were threatening to make nuclear strikes on us. And they probably could have done it, because they had just 3 months earlier, in December 2012, North Korea had orbited a satellite. And a satellite was clearly imitating a secret weapon that the Soviets had designed back in the Cold War, called a fractional orbital bombardment system. It's where instead of launching a warhead on a ballistic trajectory like a normal ICBM, you launch it as a satellite. And if you do it this way, and as the North Koreans did and as the Soviets practiced during the Cold War, you can launch the missile away from the United States and put it on a south polar orbit. And it swings around the South Pole and comes up from the south. And we don't have any ballistic missile early warning radars or interceptors facing south. And that North Korean satellite, the KSM-3, the ideal altitude, for doing an EMP attack that would take out the 48 contiguous United States if it were a nuclear warhead. Now, in the Metcalf incident on April 16th, we don't know who did it. In fact, the estimate is at least 2, and perhaps as many as 6. And the U.S. Navy SEALs, the people who trained the SEALs, looked at it and said this was a military commando op, a dry run, a practice run. Well, the day that happened, on April 16th, North Korea's KSM-3 satellite was over the Washington, D.C., New York City corridor in an ideal location to take out the eastern grid, 75%. So we're wondering if this was part of a larger cyber warfare operation. It's not one of the things Jim Woolsey, former CIA director, has been trying to educate people on, is that in the military doctrines of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, their version of cyber warfare, an all-out cyber warfare attack, would not be limited to computer viruses and bugs. Probably lose about 500,000 people immediately who, if we're talking about a nuclear EMP attack, from airliners crashing. There's about 500,000 people overhead in 1,500 airliners at pretty much at any given moment. But most of the casualties, on the order of hundreds of millions, when you're talking about 9 of 10 Americans from starvation, disease. I mean, EMP is a high-tech way of killing people the old-fashioned way. It's also a Sharia-compliant use of nuclear weapons under the just war doctrine that the Ayatollahs would follow in Iran, because they openly write about making EMP attacks against the United States in their military doctrine. And the idea here is that we're being destroyed by our own sins, our dependency on this high-tech society where we have basically elevated technology to the point of a god, makes us so vulnerable. It's our Achilles heel, and it's the thing that ends up destroying us because of our corrupt materialist lifestyle. That's how they see it. If you think about it from a practical, you see the weapon in that case, it's Sharia compliant because the EMP doesn't directly kill anybody. The electromagnetic pulse is like a super energetic radio wave. The aftermath, and it's your dependency on things like running water and modern food supply and storage and distribution systems and all of those technologies that make possible our complex modern society that makes us vulnerable. We had a small hurricane a few years ago passed through the St. Mary's County Peninsula out where I live, horse farm, and we lost the power for 2 weeks. And my wife almost divorced me at the end of that time. It's very hard to get on. I mean, there are simple things that you don't even think about, like the fact that you can't flush the toilet because there's no running water, in addition to not being able to get pure drinking water and the like. The consequences, as soon as you turn the electricity out, I mean, if you think it through, you can't get gas for your car. There's no communications. Massive food spoilage because there's only about 3 months' food to feed the whole country that's stored in these regional food warehouses that resupply grocery stores, and that depends on air conditioning systems, temperature-controlled systems, and the like. There's not that much food. Only 10% of it is in cans, and that would be very quickly exhausted. So that's where the concern about starvation comes in. We looked at what was the country able to support before we had electric grids and our modern technology. I mean, if you go back to 1914, for example, 1914, the country's population was 99 million. I mean, that's what you could support under 1914 type technology. Basically, 210 million Americans at least end up having to go away, because they wouldn't be sustainable. On examining the casualty lists further, the casualty causations further, on the advice of a brilliant guy named Fritz Ermarth, who had been the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, he pointed out that even those 100 million that might be left over probably would not be able to survive because the country in 1914 was only one generation removed from pioneer stock, hunt and fish, and 75% of the population was still farmers. Today, less than 2% of the population feeds the other 98%, and people just don't have the survival skills anymore. Possibility of a Carrington event recurring it's inevitable. It's definitely going to happen someday. And most scientists think that it will happen within our lives or the lives of our children because it happens about once every century or so. And Carrington was 155 years ago. In fact, we were narrowly missed by a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection back in July 2012. It missed us by 3 days. And these things actually, that's one of the things we discovered as we went into this most recent solar maximum, which is a period when the sun puts out more of these coronal masses, and so the risk of a Carrington increases. The Carrington-class coronal mass ejections happen all the time. We didn't know that before. We didn't know how rare they were, but they're quite common. It's just a question of luck. We're basically playing Russian roulette with the sun, and the clock seems to be running up against the end game here in terms of when we're going to get hit. So sometime in the not-too-distant future, we'll probably experience Carrington-class, the geomagnetic superstorm. On the nuclear threat, the man-made EMP, just last April, as I had mentioned earlier, North Korea was threatening to strike us with a nuclear missile. The Obama administration, by Obama administration's own estimates, Iran is 2 months away from getting an atomic bomb. I personally think that that's a hopeful estimate. I think they've already got the bomb. And the reason they may not have used it is because of their own eschatological calculations about the return of the 12th Imam and all that. They're not a normal nation state. They're not looking for the bomb for geopolitical and geostrategic reasons. It's for religious reasons, and they have their own checklist. So for all we know, I think it's entirely possible that a nuclear scud might be sitting on a freighter down in Venezuela, waiting for something to happen, like an attack on Iran. So it could be terrorist groups. It could be North Korea, Iran. That's the concern about, especially the scenario where you use an attack from a freighter. And you don't even need a missile, by the way. You could loft a weapon above 30 kilometers with a meteorological balloon, and that would be good enough if you got it over the eastern grid. That's really, the only part of even if the western grid and the Texas grid remain, 75% of our electricity comes from the eastern grid. And if we only lose that, we're basically goners because we can't. But I don't want to be too much of a doom and gloom kind of guy here, because ultimately, the EMP Commission report and our work on this was a good news story. We've known for 50 years how to protect against this. There's really no excuse for the society to be vulnerable. We could use Faraday cages and blocking devices and surge arresters, and it's not even expensive to should be doing it right now. And had the Grid Act passed back in 2010 when it was first introduced by liberal Democrats, by the way, Waxman and Mr. Markey. This is a nonpartisan thing. It's one of the few things on which conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats are united. But they had introduced the Grid Act. It was supported by conservatives in Congress as well. It passed the House unanimously. But Washington is so broken. We've arrived at a place where I don't think the founders intended the situation that we have today, where because of the committee systems and special privileges, that a single member of the Senate or a single member of the House, if he's on the right committee, can basically thwart the will of a supermajority. In this case, it was the entire House of Representatives that was stopped by one senator who didn't want the Grid Act to pass. Had the Grid Act passed in 2010, we'd already be protected. We estimated it would have taken about 3.5 years to protect the grid, moving at a leisurely pace. And, that was, it's 2014 now. So that would have been more than 3.5 years to get it done. Unfortunately, we've been trying since 2010 to get a bill, the SHIELD Act, the GRID Act. They're very similar bills. Both have bipartisan support. But the SHIELD Act and GRID have both been locked up in committee now on the House side, and we haven't been able to get the thing out on the floor so people can vote on it. Again, this is a situation, where it's because of the way the committee system works, that you can keep a bill bottled up. There is a lot of hope, though, on the legislative side. Recently, last year, my task force decided to take the state public utility commissions, have the legal authority to order the utilities. We don't have this authority at the federal level. That's the problem. The GRID Act and the SHIELD Act are about giving these legal authorities to the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission so they can order the utilities to protect the grid. The electric grid is the only critical infrastructure that basically still exists in a 19th century regulatory environment, where where the Congress, the President, they can't be forced to do the right thing and to protect the grid. I'm a Tea Party Republican, and I don't believe in big government, by the way, but there is a legitimate role for government in critical national and homeland security issues, and this is one of them. I think all of us can agree we need a Federal Aviation Administration to have oversight over the airline industry, for example, so that when metal fatigue shows up in wings and you've got an objective, independent agency that can ground that plane or ground the fleet of planes if necessary, because hundreds of lives are at stake. Well, here we have a situation where hundreds of millions of lives are at stake, and yet the federal government has no power to protect the grid. Now, the state governments do have that power. Their public utilities commissions have that power. So just beginning last year, we've started going to the states to educate the state legislatures and ask them to take steps to protect their state grid. Even though a state's grid is usually part of a larger regional grid, you can island the state's grid by protecting the assets within the state. It doesn't change the way the grid operates within the state. The defenses I refer to, the Faraday cages and surge arresters and the like, they're passive. They only come on when an EMP or a cyber bug or something like that is trying to attack the key nodes within the grid. Otherwise, it operates normally. And we've started to achieve success, very rapid success, given the little amount of time we've been working on it. Maine has passed a bill, LD 131. It was signed into law by the governor, looking at protecting their grid now. Virginia, early this year, passed a bill, signed into law by the governor. They're moving forward. And Florida is, and how do you retaliate is one of the questions that's always raised. We have our own just war type doctrine, which requires proportional response. And many would say it's not credible to threaten to, say, annihilate Pyongyang and destroy, kill millions of North Korean civilians who are essentially innocent. Kim Jong-un would be hiding someplace we wouldn't even know where in response to an EMP attack that doesn't immediately kill anybody. That's a very hard call. Would that be a credible threat? The Commission did recommend that the United States make a matter of declaratory policy that we would regard an EMP attack as just like a regular nuclear attack on a city or something like that, as well it should be regarded, and so that at least we would have the declaratory policy that might help reinforce deterrence. But when you're dealing with states like North Korea and Iran, which are so unstable and so unpredictable, this guy is assassinating close relatives and doesn't think anything about starving to death hundreds of thousands of his own people. The idea that he's going to act rationally by our lights and that he's going to calculate things the way we hope he does, well, we've just been disappointed in that over and over again just by North Korea's recent behavior, sinking an act of war when they sank a South Korean warship 2 years ago. And they've got a radio frequency cannon. It's a non-nuclear EMP weapon that they use. They were using it, they got it from the Russians, and they were using it to basically attack South Korean airliners. And we're sort of besieging Seoul, by attacking the GPS systems on the airliners for a while. So they engage in warlike, irrational behavior all the time. And they also cannot be trusted to accurately calculate what we're doing. They are really paranoid. They really do not trust us. And, they could misconstrue some action by the United States as well. Here it is. The United States is finally, so the threat of retaliation is no guarantee. Isn't much of a. I wouldn't want to bank my children's life on the idea that would work really well against. On the question about protecting against non-nuclear EMP weapons, referring to radio frequency weapons, because you can make EMP. That's another serious threat. We did an experiment when I was on the terrorism subcommittee and House Armed Services Committee, where we hired somebody, gave him a small budget and a couple of students to help him, and using only design information available on the Internet and working only with parts that could be purchased from Radio Shack, we said, see if you can come up with a radio frequency weapon, a non-nuclear EMP weapon. And they built 2 of them in a year. One of them was designed to fit inside a Volkswagen bus, and you could drive it down Wall Street. And the idea was you would fry out the Wall Street. It would work if you did that. We, of course, didn't test it on Wall Street, but we brought it to Aberdeen Proving Grounds and tested it there. Another one, second one, was disguised as a Xerox machine. And the idea there, this was before 9/11, before they'd heightened security at the Pentagon. The idea was to just mail it to the Pentagon mailroom, and it would sit in the Pentagon and fry the Pentagon defense computers. Now, these are localized in their effects, these EMPs. Still, we've arrived at a place where technology has now enabled a criminal, a terrorist, a madman who has some knowledge of electronics to, on his own, pretty non-nuclear EMP weapons.